In this module, you'll need to know about the views of 4 presidents and what they did for race relations in America. The two main ones will be JFK and Johnson, but you need to remember as well the views of Eisenhower and also of Roosevelt. So in 1945, obviously Roosevelt dies in that year, and because your module starts then, you only need to briefly remember what his views were. Roosevelt was definitely not a racist, you need to make that extremely clear, but there was only so much he could do for black civil rights, because during the time he was president, he had to get America out of the Depression and he also had to help them win the Second World War. He did do a lot for them actually in the army, because in 1942 they were allowed in the armed forces. This was after Pearl Harbor was bombed at the end of 1941. So it's important to remember he does do some things for them and he doesn't forget them in his New Deal, but unfortunately some people think it's a New Deal more for white people than it is for blacks. That's as much as you'd need to know about Roosevelt. Now Eisenhower, you need to know more about Eisenhower because he was president during the 1950s. And the thing that you'll need to remember about Eisenhower is how he didn't take a very hard line on civil rights, which was a major problem resulting in the incident at Little Rock High School. So in 1954, when the Supreme Court declared that segregation in schools was illegal, Eisenhower had an opportunity to set a deadline, but he didn't. So Eisenhower misses setting a deadline for schools in the South to desegregate, and this then means that at Little Rock High School there are major issues when now black children try to go in and try to have school there. Unfortunately, what happens is he has to then send out federal troops to take these children in, and this just shows how little he'd done so far for black African Americans. In the end, he does act decisively, and these troops take the black children in, and the National Guard stay with them for a year, but the problem is it's totally embarrassed the American government. And the only reason why Eisenhower acts is because actually they're going against federal law by not allowing them in. So he's worried that it's embarrassing for the government because obviously it's a law set in stone that black people should be able to go to any school in the South, but unfortunately this isn't happening. You'll then need to know about JFK. JFK becomes president in 1960. And it's important that you realise in the 3 years that he was president before his assassination what his views were on civil rights. Try and remember it was a masterstroke that just before everybody was trying to elect the next president, he managed to release Martin Luther King after being arrested for a sit-in, so obviously that got him a lot of black votes, and then when he got in as president he really wasn't sure which way to go on the civil rights problem. It was his brother Bobby Kennedy that really threw his support behind the civil rights movement. And due to this, and also Kennedy being impressed by Martin Luther King, he then thought, right, we should support black civil rights. So really, from 1962, he starts to throw his weight behind the civil rights movement, and he's so impressed by the Peaceful March on Washington, he asks to meet Martin Luther King after he does that speech. Now this is really significant because when they meet he promises an end to segregation, and he goes on national television and tells people in America that they need to end the Jim Crow laws and the segregation laws. This will be the biggest bit of legislation passed since the abolishment of slavery. Unfortunately, as we all know, JFK was assassinated in November in Dallas, so unfortunately he wasn't able to pass the legislation. But as a memory, like a memory to him, to actually commemorate his death, what was passed was the Kennedy Bill, and this is the first Civil Rights Act, and President Johnson, who was his vice president, passes this. And this ends segregation in America. The final one that you need to know about is President Johnson, and he will then take you up to the end of the period that you're studying. Johnson, who was a Southerner, and actually this was interesting because a lot of people thought he would be against civil rights, he was completely the opposite. He really supported black civil rights in America. He not only passed the first Civil Rights Act, the Kennedy Bill, after JFK died, but he also moved on to pass more lasting change and more legislation for black African Americans. He massively favoured King over Malcolm X because he was concerned about the violent methods that Malcolm X was using with the Black Power movement, and he wanted, if anybody was going to do civil rights, it to be somebody who was a non-violent protester like King. However, they did fall out at times. As you know from what you've done in lessons, a problem came in 1965 when Martin Luther King demanded more civil rights for Black African Americans. King wanted to keep the momentum going, so he asked for a Voting Rights Act to be passed. Unfortunately, Johnson didn't feel that this was acceptable at that point because the South were just getting used to ending segregation and he didn't want to push things too far. So, as I will talk about in another one of these, what happens in Selma on Bloody Sunday forces Johnson to then pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The final thing that Johnson passes, which really shows his support for the civil rights movement, but also is totally reaction to the assassination of Martin Luther King, is the 1968 Civil Rights Act. Now this allows Black Americans to have equal housing opportunities. So where before they were only allowed to live in certain areas, and a lot of these were the poorest areas, they could now live or rent or buy in any area of their choice as long as they had the money to be able to do that. And this was a big, big change, and this was something else that showed that Black Americans, certainly by 1968, had really started to see lots of lasting change. And the lasting change was due to two presidents, due to JFK and to Lyndon B. Johnson.